So first, I would like to welcome to the podium Carlos Rozo to talk about his South American country, which came late to the open data stage, then leapfrogged ahead to land in what would be third place in the OECD Hour Index. O for open, U for useful, R for reusable, if Colombia were in the OECD. Now, the ranking refers to the government's efforts to ensure public sector data is made available, accessible, and reuse is encouraged. So it's about the effort and commitment to open data. Now, if the third place doesn't surprise you, perhaps this will. If Colombia were in that ranking officially, New Zealand would drop from 12th to 13th place. Now, for all of you who've worked so hard to be data champions in this room, I understand that this is probably a little confronting, but we're going to actually find out from Carlos how that country leapfrogged ahead. So please welcome him. And I'm going to bring my 19 pages of notes and join you down there.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm going to start by telling you something. We just went through the process of internal validations and all the process for going to the OECD, and that should come out of Colombia, the official request that it's just a protocolary one in the next few days, which means, yeah, it's going to jump, New Zealand's going to jump from 12 to 13. So I'm sorry to have to tell you that, but it's going to be official very soon.
Okay. Well, I'm on yellow, in case anyone's back there. Can you hear me now? Or do I have to actually switch it on? There we go. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay. Well, it's going to be official, is what he said. And if you can hear me, I will start with a question right out the gate that some of you may have in your mind. Now, I can hear myself. That's better. And it sounds like, well, a little abrupt, perhaps, but it is the elephant in the room. We are talking about Colombia. And I have to say that it's surprising because the perception that many have is that Colombia was a corrupt country. So when did this all happen?
Look, it's something very surprising, as you say, because Colombia, unfortunately, also, as it's done well in some rankings, in some others, we're in positions that are very shameful, to be honest. There's a big perception of what corruption does in Colombian government, and it comes from, as we all might have read, articles in the press, we do have corruption issues. But what that helped us is, it's important when you face a crisis to try and really see what the opportunities are in there. And what we found was that being, as a government, being transparent was in our best interest. And open data is such an amazing tool for doing that. Because suddenly we had the opportunity to tell our citizens what was actually happening. Because one thing is the perception that you may have that because a contract that was awarded by the government seems expensive, that means it's corrupt. And it's different when you understand what the processes are for purchasing, what's being done, why are some companies charging more to the government. And an example is, it's more risky for them if there is a failure in the contract or any type of risk becomes a reality. They suddenly become liable for a big chunk of the impact.
You're talking about the civil servants become liable.
Or the companies, both of them. And that risk goes into the process. So that a contract seems to be overpriced compared to what's happening in the private sector doesn't mean there's corruption. It means there's inefficiencies and things that can be fixed. And the only way to get people to know that and for the public servants to be okay talking about that is to be open about what you do as government. And that means publishing the data and publishing contracts and showing the whole process of contracting companies. And then suddenly you realize that a lot of that perception is not true, that a lot of the work is being done, and we expect that to be reflected in the perception of corruption. However, it also happens that when you open data, suddenly you start looking at real corruption cases, and they come up front, and initially people get their perception confirmed, because yes, there's been corruption, but it's so amazing, and I say it as a government official, a former government official, to be able to say, yes, but it's only this big. The remainder of the public service is doing a very good job. And yes, we need to be more efficient. Yes, we need to be more, publish more when we want to do tenders. We want to do all these things, but it's not, most of our public servants are very dedicated people, people that want a better country, people that are really there because they believe in what they're doing.
So in a sense, opening the data created more trust.
It did.
Okay.
And it was hard at the beginning, and it's not only in Colombia. What happens is sometimes the public believes that the government shouldn't make mistakes. If you as a public servant make a mistake, especially in a country where there's this perception of corruption, it's not a mistake. It's that you're trying to gain some windfall or something around that. But it's not true. We're humans, and we make mistakes sometimes. And even though we plan a project very well, things happen that may not make it successful. Opening data helped us start catching mistakes way before they're really impactful. Help us see, hey, someone raises a flag. How come this is being done this way? And it has helped take a couple of steps back in a few cases and do better things. A couple of days ago, I was here with visiting an amazing public innovation lab that you have in New Zealand. And one of the things we were discussing is how important it is that you allow for public servants to try and make mistakes and discover them early, because that's the only way you can innovate. In order to do that, you need to be open and you need to be transparent. If you're not transparent, mistakes certainly are not mistakes, are those people in government doing things wrongly, or those bad employees, which is not true. Most of us really work hard for a better country, for better government, and that gets sometimes lost because of obscurity. But transparency is such an amazing way of doing things.
Okay, so fail fast. Yeah. A Silicon Valley phrase for some of you they're probably very familiar with. I also want to point out, when we talked before, you said this started in 2012. You wanted to apply for OECD membership, started to open up data, and then leapfrogged ahead. The reason that it happened was you had a particularly aware Congress in power at the time?
Yeah. Yes, yeah. I mean, it's a mixture of things. The fact that sometimes we tend to think that getting late into an initiative or in this case, open data for ourselves, was going to be a main problem. You feel like you're a follower and it's going to take you a long time to get there. But for us, as I said, was an opportunity. We decided as a country to go into the OECD. The OECD gave us all these recommendations that we needed to implement. We did implement most of them. As a country, we also thought we had the ability to be to have criteria on what made sense for our context and what didn't. But especially in open data, what happened was we had a perfect storm kind of moment. We had a Congress that was willing to pass an act that is similar to the Privacy Act in New Zealand, that essentially created a good definition of what data was, and essentially it said either you had personal data and that belongs to the citizen if it's identifiable for them. We have sensitive data, which is data you need to be careful about releasing because of its potential impact. You have confidential data, which is data you're not going to release for either national security or other reasons. But everything else, and most of the data fall into that category, is public data. That means it's data that belongs to the public, and there's no reason why any agency should not release it. Before that, well, and still before we had the infrastructure, that meant going with a freedom of information request. We want to see this data, and data would be released. But what that helped us do is we went to the World Bank and asked them, please do a study of what kind of technology we should use. We went with the OECD recommendations, and we put all of those together. And suddenly we made such a huge leap forward because we took the technology discussion out of it, and it was just about opening data and being transparent and giving information to the public.
So you made those laws, those statutory laws. Yeah, and you also didn't do it on the cheap. You took the World Bank's recommendations about what technology to use.
Yes, that's a very important point because we are obviously not a rich country. It's, we decided to implement a technology that was in the expensive side of things for opening data, but it ended up being a great decision because technology is not something that comes naturally for governments. It's always something that a few people know, but most people are not familiar with. For sometimes very good reasons. They tend to be afraid of new technologies. And when we implemented this particular technology, what happened was suddenly it was not about what technology we were using. It was about releasing data and convincing agencies to just put it in a very simple format, and from then on we would take over. And that took us from very few open data sets to over 10,000 that we have been able to use for many different uses. We'll talk a little bit more about how we use it, but essentially we decided we're not going to put any barriers for people to access data. Right now, any of you, if you go to the Open Data portal of Colombia, you're going to be able to find the contracts that were signed yesterday for any central agency in Colombia.
It's just a button on the website, correct?
It's just a filter that you put on government contracts, and you can download that. We have over 400,000 contracts in there, and they're updated daily. And that became something that, for corruption and transparency, suddenly people say, okay, so I can go and see what was signed yesterday. We can go, and we do have cases where the relative of a politician is being hired on an agency. Well, people would know if they were hired yesterday, and some of them deserve the post. I'm not going to be a judge, but in some other cases, it's very quickly that you know that those things are being done, and that helps so much to be transparent and to give that trust back into the government.
So you removed the barrier of infrastructure issues. You invested in good infrastructure. You kept the focus on what you really want to be focusing on, and that is releasing data. You also introduced incentives, and we talked about this because technology and taking down barriers is one thing, but actually getting desire and interest and participation is another. And you described a Formula One competition?
Yes.
Okay.
We did. This is a very interesting thing we did because getting agencies to open data is not that easy. And we found that we needed to get the right motivators out of there. And it happens that most politicians like when they are on top of something. If you give them any type of recognition, that suddenly makes things happen. And we came up with this competition based on the Formula One racing
event.
Yeah, and the fact that you have some teams that are on the top. So because in public service, in Colombia at least, you have some municipalities especially that are well ahead and some others that are well behind. And when you try and put them all to work together, it is very difficult for the ones that are left behind to really catch up. And that happens almost everywhere. So we decided to have different categories and put them and start a competition amongst the similar ones and recognize them for being transparent, for opening data, for showing that they were doing a good job. And the response was amazing. We had, for example, one very small municipality in a corner of Colombia, about 5,000 people live there, mostly in rural areas. And the mayor decided that by opening data and by automating some services, they could serve the people in the rural area much better. And suddenly we ended up, thanks to the competition, with a municipality that had services that farmers could access from home, whilst a few years before they had to go down to the town, and that was a whole day of going there, doing whatever, or applying for whatever services, and suddenly they could do it from home. That sounds silly sometimes for people in cities, but when you live in a remote place and suddenly you don't have to leave your farm for a whole day to go and talk to the government, you become more productive. And you can take care of your farm. And that was such a big difference.
And that was driven by this Formula One competition model. And so it's not just recognition, though. They also get training and funding and as prizes, correct?
Yeah, okay. we do that. And it's amazing how much good and healthy competition you get amongst all of them. So they pull up, and we also encourage collaboration. So someone in a township will tell someone in another one how they did it and how easy it was for them, and things start happening. So it's open data, open government. It's a collaboration issue. The more you involve people, the more you open the data, the more things start happening outside of your control, which is something also very important. We needed to let go of the illusion of having control over what data was being used for, or whatever what's being developed, we had to open data, and one of the challenges we have now is to really go and know what it's being used for. Because since we don't put any barriers, anyone can download it. We don't really know what it's being used in many cases. We only find out when something like what happened a few months ago happens is we have this agency for government purchasing. It's called, we're not that creative, it's called Colombia Buys Efficiently, literally, that's the name of the agency. And they are in charge of gathering all the information. They're the ones that publish daily the contracts. And this particular data set that they had, one day they had a maintenance window for a weekend, and they didn't tell anyone that they were going to take the data down. And as soon as they did it, someone yelled and said, oh, something fishy is happening. You took that down because they're going to do something that's probably corrupt. That's the problem with having a perception of corruption. The great thing that happened then was that someone else from the civil society said, no, we're using that data set. They told us informally that they were going to have a maintenance window, so that's what they're doing. But it seems like they make the big mistake of not telling anyone. So we had to go into damage control for that communication. On Monday, everything was up and running, and we gained a lot of trust because the data was there. They were able to validate it. And that only happens when you start collaborating with civil society, with journalists, with everyone out there. Because if we as government would have gone out and said, no, 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 it's just a maintenance window, no one would have believed this.
Yeah.
Because, well, we're the bad guys, we're the corrupt government.
It's just human nature.
Yeah.
It's human nature to distrust or question. But you did mention removing barriers from media agencies so they can go and find information without identifying themselves.
Right.
There are transparency buttons on websites. And you started to touch on this, but the key impacts of becoming transparent on Colombian society. You talked about civil society being active and actually defending government in this instance. But what social, political, and economic gains, to ask a tiny, tiny question, have there been from this transformation?
Oh, thank God that's easy to answer. Look, there's been many. And as I said, one of the issues we have now is we don't really know everything that's happening, but we do know some cases. The obvious one is the transparency for the use of appropriations and the taxpayers' money, which is a problem everywhere in the world. But the real value comes from other cases that we maybe didn't expect to happen. One, for instance, it was a couple of years ago, the Ministry for Agriculture opened up data for some soil studies in different parts of the country. That information, as you would expect, is critical for farmers. We are an agricultural country. We have more than 18 million people, families that live and depend on harvesting the right crops at the right time. And we had all this information that the government was constantly paying to have, but wasn't really being open. I mean, if you would go to the Ministry of Agriculture, they would give you the information, and they had these technical people that would have that information. But you can't scale that, and you can get too many people if you don't open the data. When we opened that up, suddenly some farmers started saying, oh, does it make sense to plant the same crops we've always planted? Suddenly, I have information that tells me maybe there are some other crops that are more beneficial for me, that are better in terms of being available commercially. And suddenly, you start getting people making those decisions with less intervention from government. And that is so important, because the less people have to wait for government to do things, the more quickly things start to happen. And that was a great example. Suddenly, you realize that if you open that information and release more and more information, more and more people start doing that. And you are playing your role as a government, because you are providing the information, you're facilitating things, but it's not dependent on you being available. And that's one example. We have many more, but I don't think we have enough time to
No, but I did tell you there was going to be some gold, and there is some of it right there, so thank you. Now, the Colombia purchasing efficiently is Colombia Compra Eficiente.
Correct.
You talked about another aspect to this, and that is when a purchase is made, it can be registered and crossed with the Department of Public Administration Civil Service Register. So that identifies when a company follows a civil servant. You can also see company networks with similar shareholders. that are arguably in competition for contracts, and maybe that needs to be better looked at. So do you find that some of this slightly too close contact is rooted out, or?
No, well, what we've been discovering, and this is a very recent effort, is the controller for the country. That agency has the responsibility to check that the execution of public money is being done correctly. And they are crossing different sources.
Okay.
The open data being probably the most important of it, to try and figure out things like, there are things that are not so apparent. For example, if a public servant moves from one agency to another, do suppliers move as well? And when that happens, there's something to be investigated, because it's not supposed to be following a public servant. Or do you have several companies that have owners that are related to each other, and you have multiple bids for a contract, but they're coming from a set of companies that is controlled by the same people? So at the end of the day, you're not having multiple bids for it. That can only be checked if you do things like open the company register. If you don't know who the companies belong to, then it's very hard to cross that information. If you have the data from the contracts, as well as who the civil servants are and what their obligations are, you can start analyzing things and going much deeper into where the real corruption is. Because corruption, we tend to think, is someone that opportunistically goes and gets, I don't know, some bribe under the table and gives an awards contract to someone. But it's usually more very well-established networks of contacts that will set up the processes to favor one or two companies, and then you will have several companies that belong to same groups, and they will agree amongst themselves who gets which contract first and who gets it afterwards. And following that, it's so incredibly difficult unless you have open data.
Yeah.
Because when you have that data, suddenly someone, without having to ask for it, will be able to see what's going on, will be able to analyze it, will be able to prevent things from happening. And we've had a few cases where, with the information that was available, it was possible for journalists to go and question processes that were tenders that were in the middle of the process, rather than what used to happen, which was once it was awarded, someone would go and try and figure out what happened before. And that proactivity is going to save millions of dollars of taxpayers' money. And the problem is it's very hard to measure. When you have initiatives like open data, it has an impact. But measuring it is so difficult, because oftentimes things become more efficient or become more productive. And making that causation between opening the data and that result is not always easy. But we know that if you don't have the information, then the productivity gains or the efficiencies don't get gained. So it might not be a sufficient condition, but it's definitely a necessary condition to have information out there to be able to make better business decisions. It impacts small businesses in a huge way. All the countries, and Australia New Zealand is obviously one of them, their economy depends on small businesses. We really hinder the opportunity to grow when we don't give updated information to those small businesses. Large businesses tend to have the money to go and do their market studies, to go and get information themselves. Small businesses usually don't have that luxury. When we open commercial data or public data that is valuable for businesses, we suddenly give those small businesses a more balanced field to work in. And that changes lives. And it's so important to that, because that's, at least the way I see it, the role of government. Mm-hmm. The role of government is not only to provide services, it's to increase the quality of life of people. And that is being done by helping people help themselves, rather than try to do things only ourselves. And open data is such an amazing tool to do that. And I think we're just scratching the surface of what it can do. It's amazing.
I'm hoping that some of this is resonating in the audience. I'd love to see some nods. And I'd also, thank you, and I'd also love to get some questions on sli.do, S-L-I.do, so that we can ask them when we open up for questions in just a few minutes. Now, is Colombia taking a leadership role in South America when it comes to this transparency transformation?
Definitely, and it was a conscious decision. When we decided we were going to do things, we decided to be world-class, and that's part of what makes Colombia be third in the OECD rankings. It's always a conscious decision that you can excel in what you're doing. And as part of that, we decided not to think that we are low in the corruption perception, but that we can do things about it. And last year, in 2018, we decided to lead with the Organization for American States, a program called the Open Data Program Against Corruption. So it was what we stood and took that leadership because we thought that we were going to be able to first show that that problem can be dealt with directly, that we had the willingness to do it, and that we have the capabilities to do it. And we've led that program for the last 18 months. We've been able to set the pace for the region. And with the open data we have and the infrastructure we have, we've started to create use cases for that to be, well, for other countries in Latin America to follow suit. And we just feel very proud that we can help a whole region because the corruption issue or perception is not just Colombia. It happens very much in all of Latin America. To help a whole region make those changes, and coming from a country that wasn't top, was on top of the rankings for all the wrong reasons. So it's a proof that you don't have to be a large country. You don't have to pretend not to have a problem to be able to lead the solution for that. Actually, the opposite. The more you know what things are happening, the more willingness you have, the more likely you are to set the pace and be able to, and this is a cliche, but at the government level tends to be true, to be able to change the world.
Yeah, no. And these are very valid points, and I think a lot of parallels with New Zealand. Speaking of New Zealand, the Open Data Barometer includes the UK and the US, and New Zealand has slipped from first to second place to below 10th and 11th place behind South Korea, France, Singapore, and the Netherlands. It seems that early adopters of open data are standing still or becoming stagnant, while other countries are learning from them, as Colombia did, and leapfrogging ahead, both in government commitment as well as implementation. So do you feel that there right now, at least in this arena, is a risk of complacency? Do you think without advocating for transparency, transparency will disappear? And do you ever worry about the strides that you've made in Colombia because you're no longer with the government there?
I'm going to start from the end. I do worry because this is, a couple of days ago, we were having a good conversation with a group of people here in Wellington, and we were talking about relationships and what makes a successful relationship. And at the end is that you can maintain the good things about them and you can evolve with them. Things like, or initiatives like open data is one that it's very easy to get started, see some benefits, and then let it fall behind because we tend to take for granted those benefits. But it's a little bit like a relationship. You can start a relationship and have a great relationship, but if you don't keep it, you don't maintain it, you don't, the proverbial go out on a date once in a while, whatever it is, then the relationship quality goes down. And the same happens with things like open data. If you miss that it needs to be done, needs to be maintained, data needs to be cleansed, data needs to be used, suddenly you can fall back very quickly. And it's, again, I'm very proud that we're third in the OECD rankings, but it's not about those rankings. It's about the services you're providing to your citizens. It's about how you're helping businesses be more competitive. And as soon as you stop providing information out or data out, a lot of those benefits very quickly will erode. So we know that this is a work that needs to be done every day. It needs to have financing, it needs to be used by people, because if we stop using it, suddenly when you realize you're falling behind, you're going to have to do a very big effort to go and get back ahead. And if your country is not doing it, there's some other country doing it, which will probably provide better environment for businesses, will provide better transparency, and people will start thinking that other governments work better than yours, which is something that we don't want to happen.
Now, I have to point out that you've left working with the government in Colombia, and you are now headed to a completely different part of the world, which was one actually I lived in for a while, oddly enough, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, advising the government there. So just briefly tell me what you're doing there.
I've had the opportunity to, I'm going to start next week to help the digital transformation unit in the government of Saudi Arabia to really transform digitally their country. This digital transformation concept is one that I wish one day we're going to stop talking about digital and we just talk about transformation, because what countries and agencies and governments and the private sector needs to do is to keep up with the changing needs of their citizens or their customers, and that means transforming yourself all the time. Right now we have the excuse of trying to understand digital, and we talk about digital transformation, but the bottom line is we need to be able to keep up with being citizen-driven, customer-driven, centered about them, and I'm going to have the opportunity to help the Saudi Arabian government to do that with the experience from Colombia and my previous life as a data technologist and technologist for many years.
So I know that some of you will want to approach him at tea afterward to find out more, because there's so much to discuss there. But we have time now for questions. So Paul, I will let you go ahead and read the first one.
Okay. So the question from Slido, the top question at the moment is, what did you do to help increase the capabilities and skills of people outside government to use the data?
Oh, that's a great question. And it has two sides. There's two answers to that. First, you'd be surprised how many enthusiasts with data are out there. Sometimes you're just way behind them in what they can do. Yesterday we were talking with someone about how important were visualizations for data, for example, if we had to create those. And we found that we can give people, if we give people the data, they will come up with amazing visualizations that we didn't even think about. So I think there's a little bit of a myth that we need to provide or give those capabilities because a small group has it. What we need to do is to let most of the people know that the basic capabilities are there. Because sometimes we also tend to go thinking, oh, we need to create this 3D visualization of, well, and what people need, it's basic data to be able to analyze it, and just that will make them jump ahead. So we need to start, and I think the most important answer to that question is, we need to start engaging more with civil society and the users out there, listening to them. What do they want? What more data they need? And stop trying to think that we know what they want, because believe me, most of the time, we haven't got a clue.
And Paul, is there another one from Slido?
Okay, well, we will take questions from the floor in a moment, but we'll take a second question from Slido. In push to open data, are there ethical mechanisms to prevent re-marginalising groups that may have been marginalised, oh, it's just moved on me, when government originally collected their data?
I think I know where that question is coming from. It's so difficult to get biased out of data. When we gather data, when we ask questions, we have, and we always have a bias in it. What we try to do, and in that I think we can learn from countries like New Zealand, because we are, even though we have a small indigenous population, for most Colombians, we believe we're a single culture, which really puts us way behind in understanding our people. But when you take bias out of questions, suddenly you start giving people the ability to analyze differently. I'm going to use an example. You can ask on a survey, how many children are there in this marriage? Why do you have to assume there's got to be a marriage for there to be children? And it's a question that most people would easily let go, because we would assume with our bias that that is a valid question. Suddenly we understood that if we were able to go down the granularity level and try and have raw data as raw as possible, then we can work with groups to understand how they would use that data and then come back and increase the quality and ask better questions. Having open data or data in general is a process of being willing to start small and be growing those data sets as soon as you understand what people need and how they're going to use it. If we try to start with big data sets and try and have the whole set of data, it is more likely we're going to end up having our bias in it, having it from the point of view of whoever is asking the questions, and we'll let people out. That's almost inevitable.
Okay, thank you. Caleb, are you ready to throw that microphone? Anybody want to ask a question? Put your hand. Okay, you've got a challenge. It's on this side of the room.
I don't really want to take anyone out on the way. You ready?
Oh, and but he lived. He lived. He's okay.
No, it's okay.
It wasn't me. Carlos, thank you. About Colombia Compra Eficiente, you mentioned about data ownership and transparency. What happens when you are dealing with multinational corporations? Are they forced in some way to be transparent about the whole supply chain of their data? And I give you a simple example. Let's take agriculture, John Deere, nothing in particular. They capture data, they go to their own private cloud. Is that data owned by the farmer, by the government, by the companies? How they interact? What's the experience in Colombia, please?
Look, I'll give you an actual example that happened to us. Cloud services, buying cloud services for government agencies. You would expect that to be easy, and it's not. Because Amazon will say that their cloud looks gray, while Microsoft will say there looks blue, so blue and gray are different, so they're different products. And we had to go through a whole negotiation process with all of them in specifying what the government needed, and including data, who had to provide what and who was the owner of what. And we created that because there is a process where we create a tender that has the basis, it's called Acuerdo Marco de Precios. That would be a framework for prices. That framework will tell all of the providers, the agencies are going to buy this, and these services, including who owns the data. And that they're going to go and apply to be part of that agreement, and only when they're part of the agreement, an agency will use the agreement to buy from them. So those discussions had already been had at the time they became suppliers for the government. It wasn't easy. We had, data was one element, but in one case we had one of the large companies had 8,000 SKUs, stock units, or different units for cloud services. We had to go through the process of reviewing each one of them to understand how it was similar to another one, and then be able to have a standard set of requests for those companies. As I said, that included data, and that just came into, it started to be used on the 1st of January this year. So we'll see how that ends up working, but Colombia Compra Eficiente is a great vehicle for us to have the negotiation discussions once with all of them, and then the agencies won't have to negotiate those kind of things, because multinationals are very powerful when sitting across the table with a single agency, but when they do it with the whole government, suddenly the balance of power is changed. So,
do you have a definition for data ownership?
in some cases we do, yes. And the Ombudsman for Commerce, they did bring out a memo or a communication about 18 months ago saying where data could be held and who owns that data according to the law that we had in 2012. So the mixture of all that gave us the possibility to actually manage that and have that information.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to take one more question over there.
Just related to that, Patty Plunkett from 8 Legs Information Management. What was the decision about the ownership of behavioural data, i.e. like the Microsoft Graph and so on? about the connections between people in the civil service that are gathered through their communications with each other, through cloud services and so on. Was there any discussions about who owns that and what happens to it?
The basis for that was our 2012 equivalent to the Privacy Act, which is a statutory law. Those 4 elements, for example, behavioral data, if it can be traced to me, that data in Colombia belongs to me as a citizen.
So Microsoft give you back the behavioral data and remove it from there? Does Microsoft, for example, give you back the behavioral data and remove it from their servers?
They have to do it if I request for them to remove the data.
Otherwise, they hang on to it
and we still have a long way to go for citizens to know really and make their rights be effective there. But we do have the legal framework.
Yeah.
So if I go to Microsoft, I don't use Microsoft products, but if I go to Microsoft, that was just a joke. If I go to Microsoft and say, look, I want my behavioral data to be deleted from your services, from your servers, they have to at least guarantee that it can't be traced back to me. So they can anonymize it and keep it aggregated, but if by any means it can be tracked to me, then they would be breaking the law.
So they can still use it, though, for their own purposes as aggregated data?
They can, and that happens with all those terms and conditions that we tend to quickly sign when we sign to any service. So the habeas data law in Colombia says if you're going to collect any data that you're going to use afterwards, you have to have the express consent from the user. And what that is usually done, the way that usually is done is when you sign up for a service, you'll get those provisions and you'll say, most of us will say yes. So yes, they can do it, but at the same time, you can go and ask for that to be deleted so it can't be traced back to you. But the reality is the benefits of using those services usually outweigh the perception of cost that most people have when they provided that.
Thank you. That having a strong and robust legal framework is very helpful in that sense.
It's key. That's so important, and also an interpretation of it that it's on the benefit of the user.
Yes.
That is also so key.
Thank you.